And now we have the present. Excellent. Hello, we have Dr. Sangaramoorthy joining in from Addis Ababa, if I'm not mistaken, from Addis, right? And then we have Courtney Jones Carney joining us from University of Maryland, Baltimore. I think she's in Baltimore. So please take it away. This will be a dialogue between two experts, one looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, the other one looking at decolonization in education. And it's going to be a wonderful conversation. And the idea is to get some of these similarities, differences, intersectionalities between these two topics, and how do we then incorporate that into one solid strategy. So it's not a diverse group of things happening in parallel, but how do we converge in our agendas? So thanks again to both of you for agreeing to do this conversation, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Courtney Jones Carney. I'm an executive director at the University of Maryland, Baltimore for Intercultural Leadership and Engagement. I'm also the director of the Intercultural Center, and I'm the program director and faculty in the Intercultural Leadership Certificate. So intercultural is all over, it seems like, everything that I do. Before we get started with the dialogue, I wanted to allow Thurka to introduce herself and provide any information to the group that's here.
Just sort of a general introduction. Yes, okay. So my name is Thurka Sangaramoorthy. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'm a cultural and medical anthropologist, as well as an epidemiologist by training. My work broadly sort of looks at power and inequities in various different economies of care. And I work at this intersection in three different areas, mainly in HIV disparities, as well as STD or sexually transmitted diseases disparities, migrant health, as well as environmental justice and environmental health. So those are the three main areas that I work in. I also teach on global health and have been doing a lot of work around thinking through how to re-envision global health education using different types of pedagogies, particularly around decolonization, anti-oppressive, and anti-racist sort of pedagogies.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And so before we dive into our dialogue, I just wanted to share that I enter into today's talk in a pretty somber mood, recognizing the need to call attention to the ways that white supremacy impacts policies and practices around the world. And so hopefully many of you that are listening, you understand what I'm saying when I use the term white supremacy. And so I'm not solely talking about individual or group actions often associated in the US with the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis, but instead I'm referencing the upholding of whiteness or Eurocentricity as the everyday norm or the standard across various societies. And so white supremacy centers assumptions of superiority of people defined or perceived as white or of European descent, while simultaneously centering assumptions of inferiority of those defined and perceived as Black or of African descent, while positioning all other racial and ethnic groups across the world closer to either whiteness or Eurocentricity or Europeanness or Blackness and Africanness. And so as we enter into today's dialogue of re-examining the assumptions and practices underpinning global health education and practice and the intersection of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, I also want to acknowledge that 1 year ago today, on May 25th, 2020, this may have been mentioned earlier today, George Floyd was murdered. And his murder was recorded and subsequently broadcasted across the world, reigniting and in some cases igniting a national and international recognition of the Black Lives Matter movement. So today may be a difficult day for some of us. We may find it difficult to be productive and engage, to meet our personal and professional goals for the day. And so I want to encourage people to take the time that they need to honor the life and the memory of George Floyd, and to reflect on the desperate need for systemic change in policies, practices, and also the educational process that many of us have come up in. And so that brings me to our first topic, which really is about how you define decolonization and what connection you see, Thurka, between decolonization and diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Thank you, Courtney. I really appreciate the fact that you brought up George Floyd's, the anniversary of his brutal murder. I think that's really important. It also helps me sort of situate where I am as someone who is living and working in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in the middle of huge civil unrest. And so I really take to heart some of the difficulties in proceeding with work as normal, right? Especially in these instances for many of us. So I want to kind of start, and I really do hope that it's a conversation between us, Courtney, in terms of decolonization. And so, you know, I think many scholars, especially Indigenous scholars, have really talked about what decolonization is not, because it is something that is really, really difficult, I think, in some ways to define. And even the definition in itself, right, could be sort of seen as inflicting harm and violence. So scholars have talked about the fact that decolonization isn't just sort of simply converting Indigenous politics, right, into our understanding or Western understanding of liberation. It's not necessarily just about helping people who are at risk or those who are suffering. It's not a generic term, right, for social justice or for struggle against sort of oppressive conditions and outcomes. So I think social justice can actually have room for all of these kinds of efforts, but it's really decolonization, if you want to look at it from more of a purist term, it's really about repatriation of Indigenous land and life, right? It's not something that you can just sort of put in as a metaphor, for instance, for social justice, right? So I think that's really important to sort of understand. It's also important to understand that decolonization or decolonial struggles can mean different things. So in the US, right, settler colonialism is very different from something that is happening in many places around the world right now. So these struggles are not necessarily, parallel. They're not even shared equally. And they're not things that can sort of neatly sort of bring any closure, right? It's not like you have decolonization and then everything is sort of back to normal, right? It's not equivocal to anti-colonial struggles, right? But it is really connected to anti-imperialism in other places around the world. So sometimes, it's really easy, and I know we're going to have a conversation about sort of decolonizing global health, right? But I think that without sort of making mention of Indigenous struggle around sovereignty and the contribution of Indigenous intellectuals and activists around decolonization, I think that's where, we have to sort of center that work when we talk about decolonization. So I wanted to sort of say that, but I think that, one of the things to think about when we're talking about global health in particular is that global health is neither global or diverse, right? Racism and white supremacy are major issues in global health, and it continues to drive population as well as individual level kinds of inequities in health on a global scale. It's often delivered, right? The people who are on the ground are often women, but the field is often led by men. You do have Western or high-income countries that dominate almost all aspects of global health and the global health enterprise. So, I think that these are sort of questions that I wanted to kind of bring around decolonization. But I think, one of the other things, I want to mention is that it's also about the institutions in which we sit when we talk about decolonization, right? Both of us are at the University of Maryland. We are a huge land grant university system. The more where we come from, I know we make these sort of, land acknowledgements, many of us do, but what these statements often miss is that institutions like ours are not just built on Indigenous land, but they were built with Indigenous land, right? The Morrill Act granted, Indigenous lands to states to actually fund universities like ours. And these were often raised, they've often raised money for college endowments. And so, all of these things have to be taken in, not just sort of in a broad sense of global health, but in places that we sit, places that we work. What is at stake here, when we talk about decolonization?
You said a lot. And I think the last point I'm kind of honing in on is just thinking about that Morrill Act and how that was used as this tool to shift from this collectivism culture to this individual culture. And so really shifting this need for ownership for Indigenous folks to individuals so that then land could be grabbed by the US and then utilized at will, instead of having like this collective culture where folks are taking care of one another and are feeling a connection, not ownership, but a connection with land. And so I feel like that is a huge point that's probably missed by many as to how land is, utilized, specifically as we think about higher education and the spaces that we occupy and build upon. And so, I
love it. It's great.
Yeah, there's so much to think about here. And so it becomes really difficult for an institution to even proactively think about how do you decolonize when you are in this, especially in the US, when you think about settler colonialism and that folks are still here. Folks have created the policies and the practices that impact folks across all levels. And so, there is going to be a huge monetary effect in order to really decolonialize all systems across the world. And so if we can talk a little bit about perhaps how do we do this in the curriculum? And so I was looking at, there was a nursing text that has been pulled by Pearson, but it specifically talked about like teaching future nurses how to engage patients about pain. And so there was a lovely chart that was presented in this book that stated, okay, if someone is Arab or Muslim, this is how they are going to react to pain. Right. And so stating that individuals who are Asian are pretty much going to be stoic about pain, and they've been conditioned not to respond verbally about pain. Folks who identify as Black are going to report higher intensity of pain. Individuals who identify as Indigenous in the US are going to want medication that has been blessed by a tribal shaman. Folks who are Jewish will be vocal and demanding. And so in this text, it pretty much created these assumptions about individuals and then training nurses about how to respond, but not responding about what an individual is telling you, but more so about stereotypes that then have been formed. And so how do we work to decolonize the way that we're teaching when sometimes these are seen as best practices, creating stereotypes and informing folks of how to respond based off of stereotypes that individuals believe to be true?
So you bring, I know this text actually really well. So, it's interesting that you bring this up because, as a cultural and medical anthropologist, right, a lot of the work that we have done around culture, right, and how culture really impacts health has been really taken up in ways that I think that many scholars in anthropology did not intend to, right? And this notion around cultural competency is a great example of when individual identities, right, are then layered upon these notions of cultural identities, right? They're not just about individuals, but then they are scaled up at the level of communities or groups or ethnic identities. And then that becomes sort of reinforced with already existing stereotypes that we often have of these groups. And I'm not saying that these are text or ideologies that are, mean-spirited, in a sense that they were not really designed for that. But what they have done is that they have, as you said, they have really stereotyped people into these little sort of, boxes, right? And it's almost as if we are only operating on individual sort of characteristics, when we know that as human beings and as an anthropologist, I need to say that we're more than just individual identities, right? We are always, as human beings, located in sort of a matrix of power, right? And so you have to understand, structural issues. You have to understand that medicine and nursing and health fields also have a culture, right? It's not just individuals, and particularly people that we think about in terms of who has culture, right? When I ask this question to my classes, right, or my students, it's always really interesting about who we think has culture, right? Do white people have a culture? Do nurses have a culture, right? And so oftentimes this notion of culture in itself becomes highly problematic, right? It becomes sort of a location where we sort of talk, when that's sort of seen as something different to what we might call knowledge or scientific knowledge, right? It's almost the opposite in that sense. And so knowledge exists, right? Or scientific knowledge in this case exists within the field of nursing. And that is sort of something that we really can't talk about because it exists. It's objective, right? But the patient has culture, right? In this sense, the patient has culture, and that's just something that nursing or any health profession just has to sort of incorporate and understand and move on. But without really understanding that scientific knowledge in itself is very cultural, right? It is a particular kind of culture and needs to be addressed as such. And more importantly, it's really important for health professionals to really understand structural issues, systemic racism, all of these things that really impact not only who that patient is when that person comes into a clinical space, but it's also about the relationship, right? That is inherent in sort of a positionality between, power and privilege. That happens in that room between the provider and the patient. Even this notion of a patient in itself is hierarchical, right? As if they don't have knowledge, right? They just have beliefs. And there's this oppositional framework that often gets constructed between knowledge as something that is incontestable because it exists, in some real space, but belief is something that just needs to be, overcome and maybe understood. So I hope that sort of makes sense. And I think it gets to that question that I think you're also asking around classrooms, I'm sorry, I tend to talk a lot, but classrooms, but it's about sort of, you know, this enters into the space about what we consider to be respectable forms of knowledge, right? And as you brought up, there's a course book, there's a text, but it's also about what nurses are supposed to think, what medical professionals are supposed to think, how their knowledge is often sort of privileged over all else, right? And so I think we can have that conversation, if you want, around sort of, you know, moving into classrooms and curricula as well, about what kinds of things that it privileges.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. But before we do that, I wanted to go back to this, what is culture, and like really thinking about the culture of a particular profession, the culture and the history and the legacy of inclusion and exclusion within a particular profession, and how folks have to reconcile that while they're in their profession. And I think it becomes really important for people to think about like what have been the historical impacts, positive, negative, in my particular profession, and how does that impact the way that I learn, the way that I interact with folks, the information that I trust, you know, how I position myself when I am meeting with folks who are, you know, referred to as clients or patients. And, you know, I think that that becomes extremely important in building that relationship, is understanding what sort of experiences individuals and groups may have had within your profession that may make it so that you really have to work to establish the trust and to acknowledge that there has been wrong that has been done in this particular profession that may have impacted you. And I get that, and I acknowledge that. And this is what I'm doing to try to make sure that you're receiving the care that you want to receive. So I think it becomes really important for people to understand that history and that legacy of the profession that they're in. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that I know that when we had a previous discussion, there was this notion of disciplines, right? When you think about the notion of discipline, right, you need to understand what that word actually means. Discipline's discipline, right? And so it's this notion of how our professions or our disciplines, you know, however we want to sort of call it, how those things are really indoctrinated into a particular sort of realm of thought, particular kinds of ideologies, particular ways of even professionalizing us. Even that word of professionalization, you know, what does that sort of entail, right? So all of these questions are really important. I am someone who sits in a department of anthropology. I'm also an anthropologist, right, by training. My profession or my discipline is inherently colonialist, right? That is how the discipline came about, was to serve colonialist sort of, you know, expansion and destruction and violence. It was a discipline that was born from that. The methods that we used, right, were used in those times, right? So these are really important, and it can be very deeply uncomfortable for folks of color, right, to be in these spaces. Because they have a way, and disciplines, right, are really meant to be reproductive, meaning that they reproduce, and they reproduce through scholarship, they reproduce through training, they reproduce through education. And so sometimes these are really uncomfortable spaces, but there are some of us who are trying in whichever way to sort of rethink, right, and to build something that might be slightly different, but without sort of that acknowledgement, without that recognition, you know, I think that those things need to happen.
Yeah, and so the idea of scholarship, I have a podcast through work, and so we talk about social identity, and I feel like it's very informative. I think that it provides a form of scholarship. It contributes to a body of work. but it probably isn't recognized as scholarship, even though there's a great amount of research that goes into it and thought and planning that takes place in creating the topics and curating the messages that are shared. And so, you know, perhaps like thinking about like what sort of knowledge sources are respected in higher education, and how that impacts the sort of education that students are receiving, and how they are then, you know, trained within those disciplines to then reproduce what the discipline has stood for years or centuries, or, you know, so on.
So I can talk a little bit about perhaps what it looks like for me. And I know others have written about this and talked about it. So I'm just going to kind of make this a little bit personal as well. And so for me, this question of knowledge really sort of, I come to it, right, very late in my career, unfortunately, in a sense of two sort of interconnected forms of pedagogies for me. One is a decolonial pedagogy, and the other one is something that's what I would sort of think about as an anti-oppressive pedagogy. So, and for me, they work together, right? For me, they have to work together. I know I can do one without the other, but you know, I really believe in the intersection of both of these. So decolonial pedagogy, at least for me, really, you take from your point of departure, right, that this traditional canon of many academic disciplines, including the health profession, has been extraordinarily violent in its, you know, exclusion of Indigenous and non-male and non-white and non-Western and otherwise marginalized voices, right, point blank. So this pedagogy requires me, right, as the instructor, by setting that historical context of colonial relations around power and privilege, it's critical to understanding where we are now. Without understanding that context and without understanding where that discipline is coming from, it's really difficult to arrive at the present moment, right? Looking at that text that you just brought up. It's hard to do that without really setting that historical context and understanding what your discipline has done, right? It's also about centering on Indigenous and marginalized voices that are, and concepts that have and continue to be silenced. Exposing students to critical thinkers, right? Knowledge producers who've been central to the development of disciplines like nursing and anthropology, but who have been systematically unrecognized for their work. It's a process that goes deeper than just diversifying the syllabus, right? It's really about helping students learn to identify and critique patriarchal influence of white and Western conventions of the discipline, and also developing tools for their own sort of journeys, right, into anti-colonial pedagogies. You know, fundamentally, what I ask students to do, and what I think is really useful, is to really ask students to rethink this rethink this category of knowledge, right? What forms does it privilege? Who's credited for the production of knowledge? Who is considered a knowledge producer? How can you center Indigenous and sort of marginalized ways of knowing and understanding the world, right? So when you center on these things, your syllabi and your classroom experience does not look the same. And this can really throw off students a lot, because oftentimes this is not normative, right? This is not the way that we're taught to learn. I was never taught to learn this way. And so an anti-oppressive pedagogy goes hand in hand, for me at least, because it's about sort of examining existing systems and combining information and values that are not taken from sort of written English language, peer-reviewed publications, right? But really, the value really is taken from the lived experiences of a range of people and contexts. So this involves recognizing that the typical ways of doing things in academic institutions are not universal, right? They're not universal. They're actually based on white values and often ableist assumptions, right? But we treat these norms and standards as if they're objective, as if they're unbiased, if that's just the way that it is, you know, and frankly superior to doing other ways of thinking, you know, or doing things. So I talked about professionalism standards, right? Perfectionism, individualism, quantity over quality, priority over the written text. They're all examples of this, right? These are not normative in many places around the world or to even any one of our experiences, but this is what gets prioritized in higher education, in these classrooms. And so you need to sort of start breaking these things down. So for me, what you're talking about, I love podcasts, but like, it's hard because some students, I don't know, there's a huge leap that happens, right? So you have to offer, like for me, I offer multiple modes of engagement. So it's actually, I use very little sort of peer-reviewed publications, right? I use text, I use media. Some cultures or communities are entirely orally based, right? And so there's lectures, there's other ways of engaging, right? Some students are visual learners. I'm a visual learner, so I tend to use media a lot, or visual media a lot. Giving students choices is also really important, right? If we want to really decenter our own power and privilege, and thinking about knowledge, it's also about giving students options. It's about exposing them to whose perspectives are represented or not. It's about being flexible. It's offering them various ways of thinking about their work. So it's not about introducing them to different kinds of engagement, right, through text or media or other forms, but it's also showing them that they can be knowledge producers in these various mediums, right? It's so much more enjoyable for me to teach when I teach in this way, because I have students, I taught a global health class, it's a larger class, it's, at least for us, it's 60 students. The final project is a multimodal project, meaning you can use any kind of mediums to talk about a global health challenge, right? I have students who do paintings. I have students who do comic strips. I have students who do podcasts, webinars, interviews. I have students who do sort of information-based kinds of written text. And for me, I don't know. I find this to be just so much more engaging and enjoyable to even read and to assess, rather than sort of sitting in front of, a paper, for instance. So, I think these are some of the ways that I sort of approach this.
Yeah, thank you for that. As an instructor, I also find it interesting, and I enjoy when students send me a video instead of writing something down. And so I think that offering and encouraging those different forms of medium for sharing knowledge is extremely important. And so at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, in the School of Social Work, this academic year, they launched a mandatory class of structural oppression and implications for social work practice that all of their foundation first year students had to complete within that first year. And I think it gets at some of those ideas that you talked about, but there still is going to be need to further develop and evolve the course and ensure that the publications, the items that they are reading or viewing aren't just peer reviewed, don't just position folks to understand what it is like to perhaps be a white social worker who's providing services for BIPOC populations. Just like in all of those professions at the various schools where we are employed, it becomes important to ensure that the resources aren't teaching folks how to be white professionals providing something to folks of color. And quite often, because of this idea of the standardization of norms and who has culture and who doesn't, and whiteness essentially just being absorbed into the air, right? And that just essentially becoming the culture being this invisible culture that people don't necessarily see or feel or really talk about, then it positions folks to perhaps be trained to approach the work as if they are white, providing services to folks who are folks of color or lower SES, but not really taking this, really holistic approach on what it means to provide care if you are BIPOC and you're providing care to someone who's white or someone who's low income or someone who has higher socioeconomic status. And so really trying to create a space where folks can understand how different identities are going to function and provide services, receive services, and then be educators and teachers in all these different realms. And so, sometimes, specifically as we think about these different forms of knowledge, particularly as a professor, as faculty, there is this idea of publish or perish. And so thinking about that phenomenon and like, how do faculty members potentially balance the pressures of publication while advocating for other forms of knowledge sharing to add to their field? So how do folks balance that need with also balancing their desire to be tenured, to, receive salary increases, to meet their needs, all of those sort of things? How do folks balance that? How have you balanced it?
So this is a really difficult and complex sort of conversation, right? I think that the academy has very specific sort of evaluative standards, right? That absolutely is based on certain forms of knowledge, right? And certain privileging of knowledge, right? So whether it's grants, whether it's publication or written text, whether it's, certain ways of teaching, right? That then engender particular kinds of evaluations from students, right? That are also these metrics around quantification without really taking into context the various ways in which these relationships between professors and students sort of occur in that classroom, right? What students are sort of professionalized to sort of understand as what happens in the classroom. And so, these things are really, really difficult to sort of, especially so again, my personal sort of experience is that, I work in a lot of community engaged work. I have mentors who are community members, right? I don't have just academic mentors. I have community members who are my mentors. For me, my scholarship, and I know for others, my work and my life are not two separate sort of entities, right? They're kind of one and the same. And so who I am as a scholar is who I am as a person. I undertake projects because they're deeply meaningful to me and they matter to the communities that I work with, the communities that I'm part of. And so, so sometimes it's really difficult to merge these two kinds of things. And so it's not just about sort of the academy, but it's also just about, it's not, if we want to be real, it's not really a space that fosters, right? Activism, advocacy, these kinds of engagements, right? That don't have a specific kind of metric in the way that we can be evaluated. So that is really, really difficult. For me, I've tried to learn, I think, for most of us navigate both of these positions, right? Sometimes at a huge cost. Sometimes your community commitments suffer because you have to sort of focus on getting tenure, whatever kinds of evaluative measures there often are. For others, for where funding is really necessary, sometimes it doesn't engender that kind of work, right? Because you're writing for grants versus others, the things that you can publish, for instance, that's another sort of issue, right? So there are all these kinds of metrics. I think at some point it really depends, right? As a graduate student, for instance, it's really different. it's really different. I mean, you're sort of in a system and you have to sort of pass that system, and you have to put up those metrics, right? As someone who's an untenured faculty, for instance, right? Those metrics are also really sort of heavy in a sense that you have to get through that next stage of tenure. You know, some of us, you know, spend, I guess for me, a lot of this work has happened post-tenure because there's a slight difference in freedom. It doesn't go away. Those pressures don't go away. That's not what I'm saying. But it gets slightly easier, right? In a sense that you have a little bit more freedom. For me, for instance, a lot of my work is now policy oriented in ways that it wasn't or couldn't be before. A lot of my work in HIV in particular, is entirely public facing, meaning it involves multimodal sort of ways of thinking and engaging with the communities that I work with. So this is sort of, you know, partnering with, you know, and trying to launch a national storytelling campaign, for instance. You know, these are not necessarily metrics that fall, and I have been told over and over again, sometimes this isn't scholarship, right? But this project in itself, for me, it doesn't matter. It's absolutely in service to the communities that I work with. It takes what their needs and what their wants are first and foremost. So whatever impact that has, it may not be in the academy, and hopefully the academy will recognize it. But the impact really for me that is meaningful, does it matter to the communities that I work with? Is the work that I do understood? Does it make a difference, right, in their daily lives? And so this is where I am in my career, and sometimes that's not possible when, you know, you're at different phases of your career.
Yeah, and that presents this huge disconnect between, you know, if it isn't scholarship, but it is directly addressing the needs and the wants of a community, then should we then be changing what we view as scholarship to ensure that it's including those individuals, that community voice is there, and that we're indeed addressing those needs. So there's that call for that shift in what is being done. And so do you want to talk a little bit about some of the effective tools that you have used, and you may have talked about this, you did talk about this a little bit, in shifting towards that curriculum that focuses on anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so specifically, more ideas on like pedagogy and classroom engagement.
Sure, I've written about this too. So there are other ways that people can engage with it if they can't get all of it. I think for me, and you know, I'll try to break it down into sort of three major sort of components for me. One is how am I presenting information, right, in the classroom on a specific topic, right? So how will information be presented? And what this requires is often, like I said, you have to offer, at least if you want to do this, right, you might want to think about offering multiple modes of engagement, right, outside of written text, right? You have to sort of really think about giving students sort of options. And this is entirely based on student-driven, right, meaning that students are incredibly capable of driving their own learning, right? And so you have to also really think about how you sort of decenter your own power and privilege by giving students options, and really thinking about material cost of courses, right, as well. Can you make this kind of information free and accessible to students? You absolutely need to really rethink in the sense of how will information be presented, whose perspectives are represented or not, right? This is really an important part of this aspect. The second way is developing supportive course policies. So building flexibility into course policies, recognizing a shared humanity, right? Meaning that we all have things, and this past year should have taught us all, right? That we all have things that we are handling. And so this notion of rolling deadlines right, for me has been incredibly liberating. I know it confuses some students and some students need more guidelines, but for me, it's about allowing students not to have to sort of produce a death certificate. Like, I mean, you know, things that really are just not necessary. So this notion, I'm not grading, right? I have to come to terms with the fact that I'm not grading on when you hand something in. I'm grading it on what you actually hand in. So I've kind of let that go. These really strict guidelines around deadlines. You know, recognizing screens as accessibility and learning aids, thinking about protecting student privacy, teaching students or revealing hidden curriculums, right, within courses in terms of communication norms, campus norms, also sharing resources that are beyond academic support. So thinking about offering information, providing support for health, for safety, for food and basic needs, right? All of these things are really, should be sort of part of thinking about how your course policies themselves become more supportive for students in your classes. And then the third thing is designing inclusive assessments. So options beyond oral participation, right? Because oral participation, again, privileges a particular form, right, of an assessment. Really thinking beyond exams and research papers, right? A wide variety of ways. So I often teach how for students to write op-eds or film reviews, rapid response sort of papers, different things that really become useful for them to engage with a broader sort of public, I guess. Alternative grading practices, this is a little bit more difficult, you know, and this is something that I'm still working on. And also giving students choices and picking the assignments that they want to do, that they feel really sort of driven to do, right? Instead of having this sort of cookie cutter way of, you know, a very top-down way of thinking about how students should be assessed. So those three things: how will information be presented, developing supportive course policies, and designing inclusive assessments. I think those are the three major ways that I've thought about sort of shifting the curriculum.
I think those are some great examples, really tangible ways that individuals can, you know, try to create these classrooms that are indeed accessible, that focus on anti-racism, anti-oppression, and then decolonializing the process. So I want to thank you for sharing your time with us today and sharing all these great nuggets on like how we begin to think about decolonialization, and then how equity, inclusion, diversity work can come together. And so I wanted to provide you the opportunity if there were any final thoughts that you wanted to share with the audience. But thank you again for participating in this interview. More of an interview, I think, than a dialogue, but you shared so much great information.
No, and I think you know, all I want to say is that this is never a set process, right? This is not a finished product by any stretch of the imagination, right? One of the things that I have come to terms with is that I was never taught to teach, ever. I became a teacher because so many teachers were really important people in my life, right? And oftentimes we're sort of becoming default teachers, right? Because we are in the academy. So it's also to recognize that maybe sometimes, you know, what and how you teach, right, really comes from watching others and how you yourself learned. You know, I loved school, I love learning, but it became almost really sort of, I was at odds with myself when I stepped into a classroom. There was something deeply uncomfortable, not about sharing information, right, but just the way that I was engaging with students. And so it's taken me years to really sort of rethink what this looks like, and to also sort of, you know, understand that I also need to be happy in the classroom, right? What is enjoyable for me? You know, what is it like to learn with students, right? I am learning just as they're learning. And so really sort of decentering my power in the classroom, that's really hard, because I didn't know what that looked like. And so these are things that I think are really important practices. And I think it helps us, right, rethink other sort of positionalities and also our relationship to the field more broadly, such as, you know, in the allied health field or in global health as well, right? It helps us think about sort of decentering power and privilege, right? And so, you know, what that classroom is sort of more of a microcosm of broader sort of things, I think.
Well, thank you so much for providing those tips. We are seeing that there's some folks who've shared in the chat, I guess, that these sort of rolling deadlines that you mentioned would have been helpful, perhaps for their child.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there are many of us who teach who think about how rolling deadlines might have been helpful for the work that we do and the workload that we are all trying to balance. So thank you again for leaving us with those final 3 suggestions.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for your time. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully there will be more spaces to have conversations.
Great, thank you, Courtney and Thurka. That was an amazing conversation. That it really kind of touched on so many different aspects of this work, and that I'm still kind of grappling with all the ideas, and also comes to show you how different perspectives, different theories, different lenses can bring different definitions into the debate and into the conversation, and then how do we grapple with these differences and move forward? So I think on the next days, we're going to try to refine more and more where we're going, and hopefully reach a point where we can, at least, as you say, Thurka, this is a work in progress. It hasn't been solved, but we need to be iterative. We need to be innovative. We need to continue to work towards our common goals. So I really appreciate that. I'm kind of taking some notes from your conversation. We started with the Gioma, we started with Dr. Gerald, Dr. Gallo, Dr. Nodimo Para. We went to the students, we came back to kind of the panel of experts, and now we close with here. I've heard a lot around humility, right? Being humble, being reflective, right? Being self-critical, right? This is kind of things that I've heard a lot. I have heard a lot around the intention and the intentionality of our actions, and how do we create and style change for long-term. And I also heard a lot about, this is a conversation that needs to happen in kind of a systems structure, right? It's not a superficial conversation. It really needs to be a deep understanding of what's happening in the arrangements of our structures that are allowing these things to perpetuate themselves, and then how do we look at those things and change. This is an ongoing conversation. I'm really excited to start day 2. As a reminder to all attendees, tomorrow we start again at 9 a.m. We have welcome words by Dr. Roger Ward, and then we move into our other keynote panel, which is Dr. Agnes Binagwahu and Dr. Samba Sow. And then we have a conversation with students from other career points. So again, I'm going to close this activity today. I really appreciate everyone's attention, all the panelists that have attended, the students, the trainees, and my colleagues and behind the scenes that have done an amazing work. So have a great afternoon, a great evening, or a great morning, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you again tomorrow. Have a great day.